inside Murphy. Shooting, save a rebound on the view.
Hey everyone, I'm Casey. You are watching the Red Rubber Duckman All Sports Network. So if you recall, on Monday or Tuesday, which I think it was, I put out part one of what would have happened if the football bowl subdivision became an English football pyramid system. So without further ado, let's recap what we went over. So of course, in the Premier Division, you had 16 teams, the bottom four being relegated, in which case this year it was Kansas State, Utah, USC, and TCU. And they will be in the championship for next season, along with Texas Tech, Minnesota, Illinois, and Arkansas. And whoever doesn't survive the championship division playoffs and the top and the semifinalists of League One. In the championship, the bottom four that were relegated were Mississippi State, Wake Forest, Pittsburgh, and Baylor. If you finished within 13 to 16, you don't need to move an inch. You stay where you are. As for the top 12, you have a chance to actually fight and get into the Premier Division. And we will go over those matchups later on in the video. But as I said before, Mississippi State, Wake Forest, Pittsburgh, and Baylor will be relegated to League One for 2024, along with South Carolina, Washington State, Syracuse, and Western Kentucky. And they will be joined by the 8 teams that don't survive the League One playoffs, as well as the semifinalists in League Two for this year. And so for League Two, for League One, actually, I should say, Houston, Purdue, Michigan State, and Cincinnati are relegated to League Two. And they already take their spots on the top of League Two. And the 8 teams that have moved out of their geographical districts, and we'll go over those in a little bit. But South Carolina, Washington State, Syracuse, and Western Kentucky stay put, while the top 12 teams battle for the right to move up to the championship division. As for League Two, there's no room for error. The top 12 get to fight for the right to go up to League One, while the bottom 8 have to move down to their geographical districts, in which case South Alabama, BYU, Marshall, Louisiana, Army, Arizona State, UAB, and East Carolina will be replaced next year by Liberty, Miami of Ohio, Toledo, San Jose State, New Mexico State, Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, and Jacksonville State. And so, as we mentioned before, the South District, these seasons for the districts are over, and the top 2 out of each district move up, in which case South was Georgia Tech and Jacksonville State, Midwest was Miami of Ohio and Toledo, East District was Liberty and Virginia Tech, and the West District was San Jose State and New Mexico State. And those that joined their respective districts were in the South, we had South Alabama, Louisiana, UAB, and East Carolina move in. The Midwest didn't gain any teams, so that's going to be an even 12 teams this next year. East District gained Marshall and Army, while the West District gained BYU and Arizona State. So with that out of the way, let's now get to each league bracket. So for this first one, we have technical difficulties. Hold on. So for League Two, we're going to start off with these playoff matchups. The 8-9 matchup for this video is UTSA and Fresno State. The 7-10 matchup would be Miami of Florida taking on Appalachian State. 5-12 would be Troy and Nebraska, and 6-11 would be Kansas and California. To conduct the matchups, we will be using What If Sports. I would use NCAA Football 14, but I'm poor. So, first up, we got the 8-9 matchup between the Fresno State Bulldogs out of the Mountain West. As you saw, they are 8-4 on the year. So this year in the New Mexico Bowl, Fresno State beat New Mexico State 37-10. In this simulation, there will be the 9 seed fighting for a spot in League One. The first obstacle standing in their way is the Texas San Antonio Roadrunners, who ended up winning the Frisco Bowl over Marshall 35-17. But in this case, they are going to be, these 8-4 teams are going to be fighting for a spot in League One. Close. But anyways, for the college football playoff expanding to 12 teams, they don't know if the first round matchups will be in their respective field, will be in the home field of the higher seed, or if they're going to do a neutral site. They do know that they're going to be doing the other 4 New Year's 6 games as the quarterfinals, and then they rotate, and of course, along with the semifinals, they rotate every year. But so we're going to go with the home team right here. But I figured for the divisions below that they'll be just doing the seeding like the FCS championships do. So, first one we're going to do, Fresno State, UTSA. The winner will face Missouri. Let's see who we got. And by a score of 31-27, it is the Fresno State Bulldogs who completed the comeback. They were once down by 17, and they fought back to win it, including a Dylan Lynch field goal to send the game out of reach. So by a score of 31-27, Fresno State moves on. As for UTSA, they will be going down. They will be staying in League Number 2. The next matchup will be Miami of Florida going up against Appalachian State at their home field. And it will be the Miami Hurricanes moving on by a score of 24-17. They were up by as much as 17-0. And Miami gets one step closer to League One. And they will be taking on Arizona in the next round. Sure it is. There we are. So now the next matchup, the 5-12 matchup, will be Troy going up against Nebraska. In this 12-5 matchup, oh, that's not even close. 47-7. Troy moves on over Nebraska in a blowout. And Troy will be going up against James Madison in an all-Sun Belt matchup to decide who will move on to League One. So the next matchup, and the final one for League Two, is Kansas versus California. All right, here we go. California versus Kansas. The winner moves on to take on SMU for a spot in League One. That's me. So Kansas moves on. My score 26-20. And Kansas moves on. So to recap, we have you have Fresno State moving on to take on Missouri, Miami of Florida going up against Arizona, Troy going up against James Madison, and Kansas going up against SMU. The winners of those games will move up, not only move on to the semifinals, will move on to League One next year. Speaking of League One, here we are. The 8-9 matchup will be Iowa State going up against Duke. The winner will take on NC State in the next round. Memphis and Air Force is your 7-10 matchup. Winner takes on Oklahoma State. Kentucky and UCF, the 12-5 matchup, going up against Boise State. And North Carolina and Auburn will go up against West Virginia in the next round. But first, we're going to start with Duke and Iowa State. All right, so here we got Duke going up against Iowa State. Let's click the button right here. And it's a blowout in Ames as the Cyclones will move on 44-31. Duke goes no further. Iowa State moves on. So Duke will stay put in League One. All right, so the next matchup will be Air Force versus Memphis. All right, there we go. Air Force versus Memphis. Actually, they should be switched. There we go. So, Memphis hosting Air Force. Let's see what we got. Oh my goodness, it's not even close. As Air Force will move on over Memphis 23-3. So, our first 10 over 7, Air Force will take on Oklahoma State. So, Memphis will stay put. So now we go down to Kentucky versus UCF. All right, here we go. Kentucky versus UCF. Holy mother of God. Kentucky beats UCF 56-26. It seemed like both teams decided to score, although Kentucky did all the scoring basically. So Kentucky will move on in League Number 1. And will set up a matchup against Boise State. There you go. UCF will stay in League One. So now the next matchup will be Auburn traveling to Chapel Hill to take on North Carolina. All right. There's North Carolina versus Auburn. And Auburn tried to come back, but it just was not enough. North Carolina will move on over Auburn 40-35. We're getting some pretty decent scoring matchups. So North Carolina will move on. And they will play West Virginia. So to recap, Iowa State will be taking on NC State. Air Force will be going up against Oklahoma State. Kentucky will face off against Boise State. And North Carolina will be taking on West Virginia. while Duke, Memphis, UCF, and Auburn will be staying put in League Number 1. We now go to the championship division as Texas A&M and UCLA will face off for the right to go up against the number 2 seed in this year's college football playoff and number 1 seed in the championship division, Washington. 7-10 matchup will consist of Tulane and Florida. They'll be fighting for the right to play Ole Miss. Iowa and Wisconsin will be going up against each other in a Big Ten West matchup. They will be taking on the ACC runner-up Louisville. And Oregon State and Maryland will be facing off for the right to play Oklahoma. For the first one, let's do UCLA and Texas A&M. So we got Texas A&M, UCLA going up against each other. Who will be playing Washington? It'll be Texas A&M by a score of 31-10. So Washington and Texas A&M. UCLA will stay put in the championship division. The next matchup will be Florida traveling to New Orleans to take on Tulane. Here we go. Tulane going up against Florida. Oh, that's very, very close. But Tulane gets a field goal in the final seconds, and Tulane steals a trip to Ole Miss and denies an SEC matchup 23-21. Tulane. Come on. Tulane will be going to Oxford to take on Ole Miss. And so Florida will stay put. So now the next matchup will be between Iowa and Wisconsin. All right, Iowa facing off against Wisconsin in a Big Ten West matchup. Winner will earn the right to play Louisville. And it is a 12-5 upset. The Wisconsin Badgers will move on 17-9, with Wisconsin turning it on in the fourth quarter. And of course, a missed extra point didn't help matters as Wisconsin scored. Well, Wisconsin actually scored the dagger with 45 seconds to go. Wisconsin upsets Iowa 17-9. And so Wisconsin will take on Louisville. So Iowa will stay put in the championship division. And so the last matchup in this championship division is Oregon State taking on Maryland. All right, so we got Oregon State hosting Maryland. The winner of this will take on Oklahoma. And it will be Oregon State, and it ain't even close. 49-9 with a 23-point fourth quarter for the Beavers. And so Oregon State will be traveling to Norman to face the Oklahoma Sooners. Let's put Oregon State in their respective spot. And so, to recap, Texas A&M will face Washington. Tulane will be going up against Ole Miss. Wisconsin, with the upset, will travel to Louisville. And Oregon State will face Oklahoma, while Iowa, UCLA, Florida, and Maryland will be staying put in the championship division. All right, that's enough relegation. It's now time for the premier division, which would be the college football playoff, expanded to 12 teams. So, of course, the 8-9 matchup is Penn State and LSU. And the winner of that will be taking on the overall number 1 seed Michigan. Oregon and Notre Dame is your 7-10 matchup. They'll be taking on either one of them will be taking on the number 2 seed Texas. And now the reigning defending undisputed national champions Georgia will be taking on Clemson for the right to face Alabama. And Ohio State and Tennessee will fight for the right to take on Florida State. All right, let's go ahead and do it. So we're not sure if they're going to be doing neutral sites or not, but we will go ahead and do Penn State and LSU first. All right, so we got the 8-9 matchup, Penn State and LSU. Shut up, bad. Let's see what goes on in Happy Valley. And it will be Penn State moving on by a score of 38-30. They will earn the right to be blown out by number 1 Michigan. So by a score of 38-30, Penn State moves on. So the next matchup will be Oregon facing Notre Dame. All right, we got Oregon and Notre Dame. Let's lock in those lyrics. And it will be Oregon beating Notre Dame 45-34. We are getting a lot of high-scoring games on this website. But regardless, Oregon will face Texas in the quarterfinals. So now next up is Georgia and Clemson. All right. So we got Clemson and Georgia. Let's see what happens. Oh man, that ain't even close. Georgia would be moving on 51-29 to set up yet another matchup between Georgia and Alabama. Georgia moves on. And Clemson, even though you're not relegated, you are eliminated. The number 12 spot you go. And last but not least, for today, we got Ohio State going up against Tennessee. All right, we got Ohio State and Tennessee for the last time this video. Hit play game. And this one ain't close either. It's 41-16 in favor of the Buckeyes. And they will take on Florida State in the next round. Ohio State moves on to the quarterfinals, while Tennessee is eliminated from national championship consideration. So to recap, Penn State beats LSU. They'll be moving on against Michigan. And the quarterfinals in the Premier Division will be neutral site games, as well as the semifinal game, and then, of course, the championships or the finals in each playoff bracket will be a neutral site. I plan to have this at the same stadium the College Football Playoff National Championship is in which case it will be in Houston. But other than that, we should be good for part 3. It should be some pretty good matchups, especially Texas and Oregon. That ought to be a fun one. Florida State and Ohio State, that would be a great test as well. And a rematch of the SEC championship, Alabama and Georgia. That ought to be a good one as well. And for the championship, Louisville and Wisconsin, I think that would be an underrated matchup. Washington and Texas A&M. I don't expect much out of that game, but you never know. But you never know. It's the college football is one of the more chaotic sports in all of America. Ole Miss and Tulane, I think that ought to be an underrated matchup as well. And Oklahoma and Oregon State would be a good one. As for League One, the most intriguing matchup to me would be Boise State and Kentucky. Of course, Boise State, they did win the Mountain West this year. And then, of course, Kentucky. They're not a team to look over either. And then, of course, League Two. Unfortunate that Missouri was down that low considering the season they had, as well as Arizona, too. And SMU, I think, was very underlooked at the start of the season by Projection Sports. Keep in mind, this is all on his system, and James Madison, the team that's still ineligible for a bowl game despite going 12-0. They were fortunate enough that they didn't have enough 6-win teams to consider. So they had no choice but to let James Madison in. And what should have been the Sun Belt Championship right here, James Madison and Troy, I think that ought to be a good one. So that's going to do it from us here on the Red Rubber Duckman All Sports Network. Be sure to stay tuned for part 3 because that's where the special games are. Because teams are going to get promoted up to the Premier League Championship in League One. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of good matchups. Anything could happen. It is college football after all. But until next time, I'm Casey. You've been watching the Red Rubber Duckman All Sports Network. I look forward to seeing you guys in part 3 until we meet again. Catch you guys later.